The first time Tessa Whitlock knocked on my door, it was 12:38 in the morning, and I had just spent 9 hours talking strangers through the worst moments of their lives. That sounds dramatic, but when you supervise night shift at an emergency communications center, drama becomes paperwork with a headset. By the time I got home to the 4th floor of the old Brainer warehouse building, my voice was calm, my shoulders were stiff, and my brain was doing that thing where it kept replaying calls I had already closed. I wanted exactly 3 things: silence, a hot shower, and the kind of sleep that didn't ask me to feel anything. I had my keys in one hand and a vending machine granola bar in the other because dinner had become theoretical sometime around 7 p.m. The hallway smelled like old brick, floor wax, and somebody's garlic noodles. Apartment 4D, empty for months, had finally been rented that week, and earlier that afternoon I'd seen a woman carrying a rolled-up rug under one arm while arguing with a delivery guy like she was cross-examining him in court. That was all I knew about her, except that she had dark hair pinned badly at the back of her head, a museum badge clipped to her coat, and the kind of tired face that still looked like it noticed everything. I was halfway through unlocking my door when I heard something behind me. Not footsteps exactly, more like the soft, embarrassed shuffle of someone who had already walked toward me twice and lost courage both times. I turned, and there she was outside 4D, barefoot in thick gray socks, wearing a long coat over what looked like sleep shorts and an oversized shirt, one hand wrapped around her phone so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She tried to smile, but it missed her mouth and landed somewhere near panic. "You're 4C, right?" she asked. And even then, with her voice too steady and her eyes too bright, I remember thinking she had practiced not sounding scared before she knocked. I told her I was. She said her name was Tessa Whitlock, new neighbor. Sorry, terrible introduction. And then she looked down the hall toward the service door by the freight elevator. I followed her eyes automatically. That was my problem. I could not hear fear without turning into a checklist. I asked her what happened, keeping my voice lower than usual because people in shock don't need volume. She let out one short laugh and said that was a very official question for a man holding a granola bar. I told her it was the uniform of my profession. She looked at the granola bar, then back at me, and for half a second the fear loosened enough for her to say she hoped my profession was not serial killing. I told her I was in emergency communications, which was either comforting or exactly what a serial killer with excellent cover would say. That got a real laugh out of her, tiny and unwilling, and somehow that made the hallway feel warmer. Then the laugh disappeared. She glanced toward 4D again and said she knew this sounded ridiculous, but there was a maintenance alcove inside the far wall of her apartment, a narrow utility space the landlord had called historic access, which apparently meant creepy little door painted the same color as the wall. Around midnight, while she was unpacking bathroom towels, she heard it open from the other side. Not a building creak, not pipes, a latch, a scrape, and someone breathing where no one should have been. I set my keys down on the small table beside my door. People usually notice big gestures. Tessa noticed that one. Her eyes dropped to my keys, then came back to my face like she was deciding whether I had just made myself more available or more dangerous. I asked if she had called the landlord. She said yes 3 times, and got a voicemail that cheerfully promised emergencies would be handled promptly during business hours. I asked if she had called police, and her jaw tightened. She said she had almost called, then stopped because she could already hear how stupid she would sound saying a century-old wall made a noise on her first night alone. That sentence told me more than she meant it to. It told me she had been trained, by someone or by life, to apologize for being afraid before anyone accused her of overreacting. I knew that tone from calls. I hated that I knew it from relationships, too. I asked if she wanted me to check the hallway while she stayed by my door. She said she did not want me doing anything heroic, which was an oddly specific warning from a woman I had known for 4 minutes. I told her heroics were above my pay grade and walked slowly to the service door anyway, keeping my hands visible, because she was watching every move. The hallway was empty. The freight elevator sat dark behind its metal gate. The service door was locked, at least from our side, and when I pressed my ear close, I heard only the building settling into itself, all old beams and tired pipes. Still, The air near that door felt colder, and when I turned back, Tessa had stepped closer to my apartment without realizing it. She looked smaller there, not weak, just suddenly out of places to pretend she was fine. I told her she could come inside while I called building security. She hesitated, and I understood the shape of it before she explained. A strange man's apartment was not automatically safer than her own. So I opened my door wide, stepped back, and said she could stand in the doorway, sit by the kitchen island, keep her phone in her hand, text my name and unit number to someone, whatever made her feel in control. Tessa stared at me for a moment, then said, "You give options like you do this for a living." I said I did, just usually with worse lighting. She crossed my threshold then, slow and cautious, and the whole apartment changed because of it. My place was clean in the way single men become clean when they are trying to convince themselves they are not lonely. One mug in the sink, one coat on the chair, one bedroom door half open down the hall. She noticed that too. While I called the after-hours security number posted in the lobby, Tessa stood near my kitchen counter and tried not to shake. I watched without watching, which is a skill you learn on the job and in divorce. She traced one finger over a scratch in the wood, then pulled her hand back as if touching anything made her too present here. Security did not answer. Of course they didn't. I left a message with my name, unit, and a tone that usually made people call me back, then offered her water, tea, or the granola bar if she was desperate enough to lower her standards. She looked at it and said she had ended an engagement with more dignity than that snack deserved. I almost smiled. Almost, because engagement was not a word people dropped at midnight, unless it had weight behind it. I told her she could stay until we reached someone. I offered the couch first, then corrected myself, and said she could take the bedroom if she wanted a door that locked. She looked toward the hallway, then at me, and something in her expression shifted from fear into a different kind of nervousness. I recognized that too late. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. The city hummed outside the tall warehouse windows, and somewhere behind the brick walls, the building made a low metallic sound that caused her shoulders to rise. I started to say I would sleep on the couch, that she would have privacy, that nothing had to be strange, but she interrupted before I could build a whole safety plan between us. Her voice came out soft, embarrassed, and steadier than her hands. "Cormac," she said, trying my name like it mattered already. "I didn't ask if I could stay in your apartment." I stopped with one hand on the back of the couch. She looked toward my open bedroom door, then back at me. "I asked if I could stay in your room." For a second, I did what I always did when a sentence carried more emotional weight than I was ready for. I tried to turn it into logistics. My brain offered me a dozen useful responses. I could move the armchair into the bedroom. I could leave the door open. I could sleep on the floor against the dresser. I could call security again, call the landlord again, walk her back to 4D with a flashlight and check every inch of that strange little maintenance space until the building gave up its secrets. But none of those answers touched the real question in her eyes. Tessa was not asking for square footage. She was asking whether I could stay close without taking advantage of the fact that she was scared. She was asking if I could be near her without turning her fear into a debt. And the dangerous part, the part I did not want to admit even to myself, was that I wanted her in my room for reasons that had nothing to do with locks, hallways, or old warehouse walls. I told her yes, but I said it carefully enough that the word almost sounded official. Yes, she could stay in my room. Yes, I would keep the lamp on if she wanted. Yes, the bedroom door could stay open. Yes, I would sleep on top of the comforter, fully dressed, on the far side by the window so she was closer to the door if that made her feel better. Tessa listened to the whole list with one eyebrow slowly rising, and when I finally ran out of rules, she said I had the romantic instincts of a workplace safety manual. I told her that workplace safety manuals saved lives. She said they also killed moods. That should have embarrassed me more than it did, but somehow her teasing calmed the room. Fear had made her sharp, but not cruel. She was using humor the way some people use a porch light, not to invite everyone in, just to prove the house was not completely dark. I gave her a clean sweatshirt because her coat looked too stiff to sleep in and because offering clothes felt easier than asking why her hands were still shaking. She took it from me with both hands, then paused in the bathroom doorway and asked if I had a wife or girlfriend who might object to strange women wearing my laundry after midnight. I said no, probably too quickly. Her eyes moved over my face with uncomfortable accuracy. She did not ask the obvious follow-up, which somehow made it louder. While she changed, I stood in my own bedroom and tried to make it look less like a confession. I straightened the blanket, moved a stack of emergency management textbooks off the nightstand, closed the drawer where I kept old birthday cards I had never thrown away, and plugged a charger near the side closest to the door. Then I realized I was preparing the room like a shelter intake, not like a man inviting a woman to stay, and I hated how natural that felt. When Tessa came out wearing my sweatshirt, sleeves covering half her hands, my first instinct was to look away. Not because she looked inappropriate, she didn't. The sweatshirt swallowed her frame and made her seem younger for 1 second, softer in a way that felt private. I looked away because looking at her felt like crossing a line she had not drawn yet. She noticed, because of course she did. She said, "You're very committed to not making this weird," and I told her I thought that was the assignment. She stepped into the bedroom, glanced at the space I had left between the pillows, the lamp, the charger, the water glass, and said, "No, Cormac." The assignment was not making me feel stupid for asking. That landed harder than I expected. I had spent years thinking restraint was always kindness. I had not considered that too much restraint could feel like rejection dressed in manners. We sat on opposite sides of the bed above the covers, the lamp throwing a soft yellow circle over the room while the rest of the apartment stayed dim. Neither of us lay down. It would have made the situation too honest too quickly. Tessa held the mug of tea I had made her, though she had not taken a sip. I told her I supervised night dispatch, that my job was mostly listening for what people could not say clearly. She looked into the tea and said that sounded exhausting. I told her it was easier with strangers. She gave me a sideways look and asked if I always answered truth by accident. I almost laughed, but it caught in my throat because she was right. With strangers on the phone, I could be steady, useful, almost brave. In my own life, I preferred locked doors and clean surfaces and no unexpected feelings standing in my hallway wearing my sweatshirt. Tessa told me she designed exhibit spaces for the Emmerich Science Museum, which explained the badge I had noticed earlier. Her job was to build rooms that guided people through wonder without making them feel guided. Light, sound, texture, movement, the small tricks that made visitors look up instead of down at their phones. She said she used to love the moment before an exhibit opened, when the whole room was dark and waiting. Then she went quiet for long enough that I heard the heater click on. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its polish. She said lately every room felt like something she had to escape before someone else explained what she was supposed to feel inside it. I did not ask who had done that to her. I had a name-shaped space in my mind already, and I did not want to fill it before she was ready. Instead, I did the thing I always did. I offered practical options. Tomorrow we could request the maintenance layout from the landlord. I could walk the hallway with her in daylight. She could file a report if she wanted documentation. I could give her the number for a better locksmith. The more I talked, the more her face closed. Not angrily, but quietly, like a door being eased shut so it would not slam. Finally, she set the untouched tea on the nightstand and said she appreciated the emergency response plan. Truly, gold star for masculine preparedness. But she did not need me to build a protocol around her fear. She needed someone to believe that if she said she heard a door open inside her apartment, then a door opened inside her apartment. I went still. There are moments when a person tells you what they need so clearly that all your intelligence becomes useless. I looked at her then, not at the shaking hand, not at the borrowed sweatshirt, not at the pretty curve of her mouth that I was trying very hard not to notice, just at her. And I told her I believed her. The relief on her face was not dramatic. It did not break her open. It was worse than that. It was small, immediate, and tired, like she had been carrying the weight of not being believed for so long that even setting down one corner felt dangerous. She nodded once and looked away, blinking hard. I wanted to reach for her hand. I didn't. Then I wondered whether not reaching was kindness or cowardice. That question stayed with me as we finally shifted lower against the pillows, still above the covers, still with space between us, still pretending the space meant more than the awareness humming inside it. Tessa tucked her feet under herself and said my room was calmer than hers. I told her that was because mine had fewer mysterious wall doors. She said no, it was because I acted like nothing could surprise me, and for some reason that made her want to surprise me just to see what would happen. I tried to joke that surprising emergency personnel was frowned upon, but my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. She heard that too. She turned her head on the pillow, studying me in the lamplight, and the room seemed to narrow around her eyes. Then she asked if I always talked to frightened women like a dispatcher. I said no, but that was not completely true. She smiled faintly, not letting me hide inside the answer. Because I need to know if you're being kind, she said, softer now, or if you're keeping me at a distance. Morning did not arrive like forgiveness. It arrived like a warehouse window slowly admitting the fact that I had let a woman I barely knew sleep in my room, and that somewhere around 4 a.m, the careful distance between us had negotiated terms without consulting either of us. I woke to pale light on the brick wall, my neck stiff, one arm half numb, and Tessa Whitlock asleep facing me with her fingers curled around the sleeve of my shirt. Not gripping, not clinging, just holding, like some sleeping part of her had reached across the space I had so carefully left and decided the rules could be amended. I stayed perfectly still because I had handled hostage calls, gas leaks, panicked parents, and one man who had called 911 because a raccoon was staring at him through a bathroom window, but I had no training for the quiet disaster of wanting to move closer to someone who had trusted me enough to fall asleep. Her hair had come loose during the night and lay across the pillow in dark, uneven waves. My sweatshirt was bunched under her cheek. She looked less like the sharp woman who had challenged me in my hallway and more like somebody who had finally stopped bracing for impact. When she woke, her eyes opened slowly, then focused on my sleeve in her hand. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Then she released me like I was evidence at a crime scene and whispered that she had not meant to emotionally restrain me in my own bed. I told her I had survived worse captivity, mostly staff meetings, and the laugh that came out of her was rough with sleep and embarrassment. She sat up too quickly, then winced, and I had to fight the instinct to ask if she was dizzy, hungry, cold, anxious, dehydrated, or experiencing any other symptom I could turn into a task. Instead, I asked if she wanted coffee. She looked at me from under messy hair and said that depended on whether my coffee was as aggressively responsible as the rest of me. I told her my coffee had never missed a deadline. She said that sounded horrifying, but she followed me to the kitchen anyway, bare feet quiet against the floor, sleeves still pulled over her hands. My kitchen had never felt smaller. Usually, it was just a place where I reheated leftovers and pretended eating over the sink counted as efficiency. With Tessa leaning against the counter in my sweatshirt, watching me measure grounds like I was diffusing something, it became another kind of room entirely. She noticed everything. The labeled tin of batteries in the drawer I opened by mistake, the 3 phone chargers coiled in a ceramic bowl, the flashlight mounted near the pantry. She said I looked like the kind of man who had a backup plan for his backup plan, and I told her that was unfair because I also had a contingency binder. She stared at me, horrified and delighted, and said, "Cormac Rourke, you are one laminated emergency contact sheet away from becoming a public service announcement. I should have defended myself. Instead, I almost laughed into the coffee filter, because hearing my full name in her morning voice did something to me I was not prepared to put in words. She took the mug I handed her with both hands and sipped carefully, eyes closing for half a second. I told myself not to enjoy that too much. Then she opened one eye and said, "Unfortunately, the coffee was excellent, which made me dangerously useful. Useful. The word should not have mattered." She meant it lightly. I knew she meant it lightly. But some words have hooks in them, and that one caught on old scar tissue before I could stop it. My last relationship had ended slowly, then all at once, with a woman who said I was safe like it was praise until it became the reason she was bored. Dependable, steady, kind, all the polite adjectives people used when they were grateful you existed but not particularly excited to come home to you. I had learned to accept being needed because needed had instructions. Wanted was messier. Wanted could change its mind. Tessa saw my face change. I tried to cover it by reaching for the sugar, even though neither of us had asked for any, which was not subtle. She lowered her mug and asked what she had said. I told her nothing. She looked at me like I had just handed her an exhibit label that read, obvious lie. Then she said she was good at rooms because people always thought rooms were silent, but they told on everyone. My kitchen, apparently, had just told on me. I wanted to be annoyed by how quickly she read me. Instead, I felt exposed in a way that was almost restful, as if she was not trying to catch me doing something wrong, only trying to understand why I had flinched. So I said useful was a complicated word for me. She did not push. She only nodded, and that restraint, coming from her, felt different from mine. Mine built walls. Hers opened a door and waited. The landlord finally called back at 8:12, with the bright, careless tone of a man who had slept through every strange noise in the city. I put him on speaker at Tessa's request, and we listened while he explained that old buildings made old building sounds, that maintenance sometimes accessed internal spaces, that she was probably hearing pipes, and that nobody had entered her unit because nobody had reported entering her unit. Tessa stood very still. I watched her expression flatten into politeness, and it made me angrier than if she had shouted. She thanked him in a voice so calm I could tell it cost her something, then ended the call before he finished promising to look into it. For a moment, she stared at the phone in her hand. Then she said, almost to herself, that being dismissed by men before breakfast was starting to feel like a brand identity. I wanted to take the phone, call him back, and make the kind of complaint that would ruin his morning. Instead, I remembered her face the night before when she told me she did not need a protocol. I asked what she wanted to do next. That made her look up, not because the question was clever, but because it left the steering wheel in her hands. She said she wanted to go back to 4D in daylight, get real clothes, and pretend she had not spent her first night in Milwaukee asking a stranger to guard her sleep. I told her she could pretend that if she wanted, but for the record, I had not minded. Her eyes shifted to mine, and the quiet between us changed again. She was still wearing my sweatshirt. Her hair was still a little wild. I was still holding a mug I had forgotten to drink from. Then her mouth curved, not quite teasing now, and she said she had noticed that I did not mind, which was a dangerous thing for a woman trying to rebuild her common sense. She went still when her phone buzzed. At first I thought it was the landlord again, or maybe building security finally discovering the concept of employment. But the color left her face so quickly that my body reacted before my mind did. I stepped closer, then stopped myself. She looked at the screen, swallowed once, and turned it just enough for me to read the message from a name saved without a heart, without a photo, without anything but 2 words. Sterling Vale. The text said, "I heard you moved. We should talk before you make this worse." Tessa's thumb hovered over the screen, and the room that had been warm a second earlier suddenly felt full of locked doors. Tessa did not open the message. She just stood there with my sweatshirt sleeves covering her hands, staring at Sterling Vale's name like it had found a way to enter the room without using a door. I had heard enough fear and enough voices to know when someone was not surprised, only tired of being right. I asked if Sterling was the engagement she had ended with more dignity than my granola bar deserved, and she gave me a look that almost became a smile before it failed. She said he was the kind of man people described as impressive before they described him as kind, and that should have warned her earlier. In public, he ran donor dinners, charity campaigns, city arts initiatives, all of it with the smooth sincerity of a man who knew exactly where the cameras were. In private, he never raised his voice. He just corrected the temperature of hers. Too emotional, too defensive, too sensitive, too dramatic, too quick to misunderstand. By the end, she said, she could walk into a room already apologizing for feelings she had not had yet. I wanted to say several things about Sterling Vale, none of them useful and most of them professionally inadvisable. Instead, I asked what she wanted. Tessa looked at me as if I had interrupted the script she expected me to follow. I could see the options she had prepared for, me grabbing the phone and declaring war, me telling her to ignore him, me offering advice with the confidence of a man who did not have to live inside the consequences. But I had learned one thing from the night before. Believing her meant leaving her inside her own choices. She sat at my kitchen table and finally opened the message, reading it once, then again, her mouth tightening on the second pass. She said Sterling never wrote anything without an audience in mind, even texts. "Before you make this worse," sounded like concern, but it really meant he had already started telling people she was unstable. I asked who people meant. She said mutual friends, museum donors, board members, anyone who liked his version of a woman better when she was grateful, quiet, and standing beside him in good lighting. The phone buzzed again before she answered him. This time, it was not Sterling. It was a friend from her old circle asking if she was okay because Sterling had mentioned she had left suddenly and everyone was worried. Tessa let out a small laugh with no humor in it. She said he was fast. I said men like that usually were when control started slipping. She looked up at me then, and something passed over her face. Not relief exactly, but recognition, like I had named the shape of a thing without asking her to prove it existed first. For a few minutes we sat there with coffee cooling between us while the morning moved around my apartment like nothing had changed. Outside, a delivery truck groaned in the alley. Somewhere below us, a dog barked at the elevator. Inside, Tessa was deciding whether to respond to a man who had built a reputation out of sounding reasonable. My phone rang from the counter, and when I saw Anika Rao's name, I almost ignored it. Annika worked the same shift I did, which meant she knew better than to call after a rough night unless she had either gossip, caffeine, or concern. I answered because I needed one normal voice in the room. She asked if I was alive after the dispatch center's little parade of chaos, then paused after hearing my hello and said, "Oh, that's your careful voice. Who are you being careful with?" Tessa glanced at me over her mug, and I turned slightly like that would hide the entire existence of another human in my kitchen. I told Anika I had a situation with a neighbor. She said I always had a situation with somebody because I attracted emergencies the way open windows attracted flies. I said this was different. That was my mistake. Anika went quiet for half a second, then said different was dangerous for men who confused being calm with being unavailable. I should have walked into the hall for privacy, but Tessa had already heard enough to understand the shape of it. Anika told me, not unkindly, that if someone had actually made it past my locked-down little life, I should not treat her like a caller on line 2. I said she did not know what she was talking about. Anika laughed once and said she had supervised beside me for 6 years, which meant she knew exactly what she was talking about. Then she softened and told me there was a difference between protecting someone and letting them know they had affected me. When I ended the call, Tessa was not pretending she had not listened. She was leaning against the counter, her hands around the mug, studying me with that same unnerving patience she had shown in the bedroom. I tried to make a joke about coworkers lacking boundaries. She said maybe Anika just knew where mine were buried. That should have made me defensive. Instead, it made me tired in a way I could not hide. Tessa stepped closer. Not much, just enough that I could smell my laundry soap on the sweatshirt and something faintly citrus from her hair. She said I did not have to make myself harmless to be trusted. I looked at her mouth before I meant to. She noticed, because she noticed everything, and this time she did not rescue me with sarcasm. The apartment went quiet around us, the kind of quiet that does not mean nothing is happening. I wanted to kiss her. I wanted it badly enough that the want scared me, because wanting had never been one of my controlled environments. So I asked if stopping was what she wanted. Her eyes softened, and she said no, but she respected that I had asked. I did not kiss her then. Maybe I should have. Maybe the braver man would have. But something about the phone on the table, Sterling's name still glowing in the air between us, made me want our first kiss to belong to us and not to his shadow. Tessa seemed to understand that, though it frustrated her. She smiled a little and said I was either the most disciplined man she had ever met or the most emotionally inconvenient. I told her both could be true. By late morning, she decided she was ready to go back to her apartment in daylight, not because she felt fearless, but because she hated the idea of Sterling's message turning her first day into hiding. I walked beside her, not ahead of her, and she noticed that too. At 4D, she took out her keys, then stopped so suddenly I almost bumped into her. The door was not wide open. It was worse than that. It sat barely cracked, just enough for the dark seam between the door and the frame to show. Tessa's face went still. I knew before she said it that she had locked it. Her voice came out quiet, flat, and absolutely certain. "Cormac," she said, "I know I locked that door." For a moment, neither of us touched the door. That thin black line between wood and frame felt louder than a broken lock would have, because a broken lock could be explained. A door left barely open looked intentional, almost polite, like whoever had done it wanted Tessa to know they had been there without giving her enough proof to make anyone else care. I asked her to step back into the hall, and she did, but not because I ordered her. She did it with her eyes still fixed on the crack, her keys clenched between her fingers like they could become a weapon if belief failed. I called building security again and got voicemail again, which made me consider a career change into personally disappointing every landlord in Milwaukee. Then I called the non-emergency police line, gave the facts carefully, and heard myself slipping into that steady voice I used at work. Tessa watched me while I spoke, and I could tell she appreciated the calm and resented needing it at the same time. When I pushed the door open, I went first, only after asking her if that was what she wanted. She nodded, but her mouth tightened at the question, like the courtesy hurt, because she was not used to it. Her apartment looked exactly like a first apartment after a rushed move. Boxes stacked in crooked towers, packing paper on the floor, a rolled rug leaning against the brick wall, half-built shelves, one lamp still wearing a tag. Nothing was overturned. No drawers hung open. No obvious disaster waited inside. That almost made it worse. Tessa stood just behind me and whispered that this was how Sterling used to win arguments, too. Nothing dramatic enough to prove, just enough wrong to make her sound unreasonable if she said it out loud. I looked around the room, not for drama, but for something that did not belong to the ordinary mess of moving. Near the window, on the floor beside a low shelf, sat a small model room made of foam board and translucent plastic. It had tiny paper people inside and little strips of colored gel taped over the windows. I had seen it on the shelf the night before when I checked her living room from the doorway. Now it was on the floor. Tessa saw where I was looking and went very still. She crossed the room slowly, then crouched in front of the model without touching it. She said it was a scale mock-up for her first exhibit at the Emmerich, a room about how people navigate darkness when they think they are alone. Then she gave a quiet laugh that made my chest ache and said that was a little on the nose, even for a museum. I asked if anything else looked moved. She shook her head, then changed it to a maybe, then hated herself for the uncertainty. I told her maybe was still information. She looked at me then, and the expression on her face was so open for half a second that I almost forgot to be careful. She asked if I ever got tired of making people feel less crazy. I told her yes, but not with her. That answer came out before I could wrap it in something safer. A voice in the doorway said, "Well, that is either very sweet or the beginning of a terrible decision," and both of us turned. Mabel Keene from 4B stood there holding 2 canvas grocery bags and wearing a purple raincoat, even though it was not raining. I knew Mabel in the way everyone in the building knew Mabel. She collected packages before thieves could, judged elevator etiquette with her eyebrows, and somehow knew which couples were breaking up before the couples did. She looked from Tessa to me, then to the open door, and her face lost its mischief. Tessa explained enough without explaining everything. Mabel listened, then said maintenance had been on the 4th floor earlier that morning, which would have been useful information if anyone had bothered to tell the new tenant. She also mentioned, as if discussing the weather, that a very pretty man in a wool coat had been in the lobby asking whether Miss Whitlock had settled in yet. According to Mabel, he had smiled like a brochure and tipped his head toward the mailboxes a little too casually. Tessa closed her eyes. I felt my anger move through me like heat, but I did not let it take the wheel. Mabel added that she had not told him anything, because men who smiled that smoothly at 11 in the morning usually wanted either money or control, and she had limited patience for both. Tessa laughed despite herself, and the laugh steadied the room more than my presence had. After Mabel left, Tessa stood in the middle of her apartment, arms wrapped around herself, and said she did not know whether Sterling had arranged anything, whether maintenance had been careless, or whether the building was simply a haunted administrative failure. What she did know was that Sterling had found the building, had already started telling people she was unstable, and now every strange thing would make her wonder if she was being warned or if she was losing her grip. I wanted to make calls. I wanted to document the maintenance access, demand camera footage, find Sterling, and introduce him to the least charming parts of my vocabulary. But Tessa turned toward me before I moved. She said, "Please don't take over." Not sharply, not ungratefully, just honestly. I stopped. She said she had spent too long inside stories other people told about her, and if this was going to be her life again, she needed to be the one holding the pen. So I sat beside her on the floor while she picked up her phone. She drafted one text to Sterling, deleted it, drafted another, deleted that too, then finally wrote that he was not welcome at her apartment, not welcome to contact her workplace about her personal life, and not welcome to describe her decisions as confusion. She did not ask me to approve it. She only asked me to stay close enough that she remembered she was not alone. When she hit send, her hand trembled. I did not cover it with mine. I set my hand palm up on the floor between us and let the choice be hers. After a long second, she slipped her fingers into mine. The phone buzzed almost immediately, so fast it felt like Sterling had been waiting with his thumb over the trigger. Tessa read the message, and the color drained from her face again. She turned the screen toward me. Sterling had written, "Careful, Tess. People are already worried about you." The museum preview was that evening, which meant the rest of the day carried the strange pressure of a room waiting to become public. Tessa tried to treat Sterling's message like an ugly piece of mail she could set aside until later, but I could see it following her from box to box as she unpacked. Every time her phone buzzed, her shoulders decided the worst before her eyes confirmed anything. I stayed because she asked me to stay, not because I had appointed myself guardian of apartment 4D, and that distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. Around noon, the landlord finally sent a maintenance man who looked like he had been assembled from apologies and coffee, and he confirmed that the internal utility access had been opened earlier for a pipe inspection nobody had bothered to schedule properly. That explained part of it. It did not explain Sterling showing up in the lobby, or the model moved from the shelf, or the way Tessa's fear had been treated as an inconvenience until I had given it a male witness. She heard the explanation with her arms crossed, thanked him politely, then waited until he left before saying she hated how much relief could feel like humiliation. I told her relief was allowed to be messy. She looked at me from across the room, where she was carefully wrapping the little exhibit model in tissue paper for transport, and said that sounded like something a man would say after surviving years of laminated contingency planning. I told her my contingency planning had kept us alive so far. She said it had kept us caffeinated and moderately supervised, which was not the same thing. That was the rhythm we had found somehow. Fear, honesty, a joke sharp enough to let us breathe. By late afternoon, she had stopped pretending she was not nervous about the preview. The Emmerich Science Museum had given her one room, one donor crowd, and one chance to prove she had not fallen apart after leaving Sterling. She did not phrase it that way, but she did not have to. I watched her check the same small bag 3 times. Badge, notes, lipstick, exhibit remote, phone. Then she looked up and asked if I was going to offer to drive her or if I was currently fighting the urge because of my growth journey. I said I was absolutely fighting the urge. She asked who was winning. I told her that depended on whether she wanted a ride. Tessa smiled then, tired but real, and said she did. That small answer felt like more than transportation. It felt like trust with its shoes on. I went back to my apartment to change, and when she knocked 20 minutes later, the hallway seemed to lose sound around her. She wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy, nothing designed to beg for attention, but it fit her like she had decided to stop apologizing for having a body in a room. Her hair was pinned back on one side, leaving the faint line of her neck visible, and she held a coat over one arm like armor she had not decided to put on yet. I forgot every calm sentence I had ever used professionally. She noticed immediately, because Tessa noticed silence the way other people noticed shouting. She asked if the dress was too much. I said no. Then, because no was embarrassingly incomplete, I told her she looked like someone who knew exactly where the exits were but had decided to enter anyway. Her expression changed, softening in a way that made my chest tighten. She said that might be the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, which was either tragic or deeply flattering. I told her I was willing to accept both. She stepped into my apartment instead of waiting in the hall, and suddenly we were standing too close near the entry table, her coat brushing my sleeve, the museum badge in her hand, Sterling's message still somewhere behind her eyes. I wanted to tell her she would be brilliant tonight. I wanted to tell her he did not get to define the room. I wanted to tell her she had already survived the hard part, but wanting to comfort her was not the same as wanting her, and she had become much too important for me to hide one inside the other. Tessa looked up at me and said my face was doing that controlled thing again. I said my face had a demanding job. She did not smile this time. She asked if I wanted her. Just like that. Not dramatically, not coyly, not as a test she hoped I would fail. The question landed between us with nowhere decent to run. I could have said of course. I could have said this was not the time. I could have made a joke about workplace safety manuals and moods and escaped through a door I had built myself. Instead, I told her the truth badly, because the truth had not been rehearsed. I told her, yes, I wanted her, and that was exactly why I kept stopping. Her eyes searched mine, wary and hopeful at once. I said being needed was easier. Needed people got thanked. Needed people got called during emergencies and released when the situation stabilized. Wanted people had to stand there after the siren stopped and hope the other person still meant it. Wanted people got left with toothbrushes and drawers and silence on the wrong side of the bed. She did not interrupt me. That might have been the kindest thing she did all day. I told her my last relationship had made me good at being reliable and terrible at believing reliability could be desired. I had become the man who fixed the lock, drove in bad weather, remembered appointments, handled hard conversations, and somehow still was not the man she chose when she wanted to feel alive. Tessa's face tightened, not with pity, but anger on my behalf, which I was even less prepared for. She set her coat on the table and stepped closer until there was no polite distance left. She said Sterling used to make her feel like wanting anything too clearly was evidence against her. I made myself feel like wanting anything too clearly was unsafe. Then she touched the front of my shirt with 2 fingers, light enough that I could have pretended it was nothing if I were a coward. "I'm asking you as clearly as I know how," she said. "Are you stopping because you don't want this, or because you're scared I do?" I kissed her because there was no answer more honest that I trusted myself to say first. It was careful for maybe one breath, a question asked against her mouth, and then she answered by leaning into me with a sound so soft it nearly undid every rule I had ever made. My hand rose to her cheek, her fingers curled into my shirt. There was nothing frantic in it, nothing borrowed from fear or Sterling or the strange door in her apartment. It was quiet and full and mutual, the kind of kiss that did not solve either of us but told the truth about where we were standing. When we pulled apart, her eyes were bright, and she whispered that I had terrible timing. I rested my forehead against hers and said I had been told my romantic instincts needed continuing education. She laughed, and the laugh shook a little. And then she kissed me once more, brief but certain, before stepping back to pick up her coat. The museum was all glass, white walls, soft lighting, and people speaking in the careful voices they used around donors and expensive cheese. Tessa changed as we walked in. Not completely. I could still see the woman who had held my sleeve in her sleep, but she straightened into the version of herself that knew sightlines, acoustics, and how to make a room obey. Her exhibit was called Dark Adaptation, and it led visitors through a controlled sequence of dim spaces where hidden details slowly appeared as their eyes adjusted. I watched her explain it to a board member, and I understood something about her I had only felt before. Tessa did not design darkness to scare people. She designed it to prove they could learn to see inside it. Then Sterling Vale appeared near the donor wall in a navy suit, smiling like he had been invited by the concept of concern itself. He crossed the room with a glass in his hand and greeted Tessa as if the last 24 hours had been a misunderstanding between reasonable adults. I stayed beside her, not touching her, because I could feel how much effort it took for her not to step back. Sterling's eyes moved over me once, quick and dismissive, then returned to her with polished warmth. He said he was glad she had support during this confusing transition. Tessa's fingers tightened around the exhibit remote. Before she could answer, a trustee called for a toast, and Sterling, somehow already holding the room's attention, lifted his glass with that practiced, gentle smile. He said he wanted to honor Tessa's talent, her sensitivity, and the new support system helping her through a difficult time. Then he looked directly at me and added that everyone deserved patience while they found their way back to themselves. The room softened around him. That was his gift. He could make a knife sound like a blessing. Tessa went very still beside me, and I knew the old script had found her again. I had watched people lose control before. Not the loud kind, not always. Sometimes losing control looked like a woman standing perfectly still in a beautiful room while everyone around her accepted the version of her life that someone else had just handed them. Sterling's toast landed softly, which made it worse. A few donors nodded with sympathetic faces, the kind people wear when they think they are witnessing delicacy instead of damage. Tessa did not move, but I saw her thumb press hard against the edge of the exhibit remote. I wanted to step forward. Every part of me that had ever answered a crisis wanted to cut through the room, name what he was doing, and make myself useful in the cleanest, loudest way available. But Tessa had not asked me to rescue her story. She had asked me, over and over in ways I was only beginning to understand, not to become another man who spoke over her in the name of care. So I did the hardest thing I had done in a long time. I stayed beside her, not behind her like I was waiting to disappear, not in front of her like I was waiting to fight, just close enough that when she turned her head slightly, she could see I was still there. Her eyes met mine for less than a second. That was all. But something in her face changed, not into confidence exactly, because confidence would have made it sound easy. It changed into decision. Sterling was still smiling when she stepped forward, and the room gave her the kind of polite attention people give a woman they expect to be graceful about being cornered. Tessa looked at the donors, the trustees, the museum director, then at the entrance to her exhibit, where the first dark room waited with its hidden walls and low path lights. She thanked Sterling for his concern, and for one awful second I thought she was going to smooth it over. Then she said concern could be a generous thing when it left room for the person receiving it to remain real. Her voice did not shake at first. Then it did, and she kept going anyway. She told them the exhibit was built around a simple truth. When people enter darkness, their first instinct is to let someone else describe the room to them. A guide, a map, a voice, a hand on the elbow. But if they wait long enough, their own eyes begin to adjust. They start seeing edges, shapes, exits, details that were always there but hidden by panic. She said she had spent too much of her life letting one person describe her fear, her choices, her ambition, and even her leaving. Then she turned towards Sterling, not angrily, not theatrically, but with the calm of a woman who had finally found the light switch inside herself. She said she ended their engagement because she was tired of being loved only when she agreed to be interpreted. The room changed. You could feel it, the little social machinery trying to decide where sympathy should go now. Sterling laughed softly, because men like him always reached for softness when control slipped. He said Tessa was emotional tonight, understandably, and maybe this was not the place. That was when Mabel Keene's voice came from somewhere near the back, clear as a bell and twice as sharp. She said that if this was not the place, he should not have brought his little performance to the cheese table. I turned and saw Mabel standing beside a display case with a museum program in one hand and a miniature quiche in the other, looking absolutely prepared to ruin a man's evening on principle. Tessa blinked, startled enough that a laugh almost escaped her. Sterling's smile faltered. Mabel continued, because apparently nobody had ever successfully stopped her once she reached operating temperature. She said the same polished gentleman had been in our building lobby that morning asking about Miss Whitlock's new apartment, and she had found it odd because decent people usually called before appearing in places where they were not invited. Sterling's jaw tightened so slightly most people missed it. I did not. Annika, who had arrived during the toast and was now standing near the exit with her arms folded, caught my eye with the expression she usually reserved for callers who insisted they were just asking questions while actively causing a problem. She moved casually, almost lazily, until she stood between Sterling and the hallway Tessa would need if she chose to leave, not blocking him dramatically, just making it clear that public charm would have to walk around witnesses now. Tessa looked at Mabel, then Annika, then me. I could see the realization settle over her that being supported did not have to mean being swallowed. No one had taken her voice. No one had made her small in order to keep her safe. Sterling tried one more time, lowering his voice as if intimacy could be performed at a distance. He said, "Tess, you know this isn't you." And Tessa, who had been afraid of that sentence since the first message, smiled a little, not kindly. Not cruelly, just freely. She told him that was the problem. He had only ever recognized the version of her that made him comfortable. The rest of her had been waiting for him to leave the room. After that, there was no explosion. Real endings almost never give the people watching the satisfaction they expect. Sterling did not shout. Tessa did not collapse. The museum director cleared her throat and smoothly redirected the crowd toward the exhibit entrance, because institutions survive awkwardness by scheduling around it. Sterling stood there for a moment, abandoned by the room's attention, which for a man like him was probably the closest thing to silence. Then he set his glass down and left with Annika's eyes following him all the way to the doors. Tessa did not watch him go. She looked at the exhibit instead, at the dark room she had built, and I could tell she was breathing differently. Outside the museum, the night air was cold enough to make both of us realize we had forgotten our coats in the emotional wreckage. For a minute, we just stood under the awning while traffic slid past on wet pavement. Tessa's hand found mine, not desperately, not for balance, but because she wanted it there. I told her she had been extraordinary. She shook her head and said she had been terrified. I said I knew. She looked at me then, eyes bright, and asked if that changed the compliment. I told her it was the compliment that made her mouth tremble, but she did not cry. Not yet. Instead, she stepped closer and asked if I was still trying to be harmless. I thought about all the careful words I had used as armor, all the times I had mistaken distance for respect because closeness gave someone the power to leave. Then I told her no. I told her I wanted her, not because she knocked on my door scared, and not because I liked being needed, but because she kept choosing truth even when her voice shook. For once, I did not soften the sentence after I said it. I let it stand there in the cold between us, imperfect and alive. Tessa closed her eyes for a second like she was letting herself believe it slowly. Then she opened them and said she did not want to go back to her apartment yet. My chest tightened, but I did not rush ahead of her meaning. I asked where she wanted to go. Her fingers tightened around mine, and the smallest smile touched her face. Is your room still open? I had spent most of my adult life thinking the hardest calls were the ones where people screamed. They weren't. The hardest ones were the quiet calls. The ones where someone had already used up every dramatic sound they had and was left with only a small voice asking if anybody was still there. When Tessa asked if my room was still open, she did not sound like the woman from the night before, frightened in socks and borrowed courage. She sounded tired, proud, and very aware of what the question meant now. There was no mysterious door behind her, no landlord voicemail, no Sterling Vale trying to make himself the narrator. There was only Tessa standing under the museum awning with her hand in mine, asking for closeness without disguising it as crisis. I told her yes, because there are some words a man should not decorate when the truth is already standing in front of him. We picked up our coats, said goodnight to Annika, and let Mabel Keene inform both of us that museum cheese was overrated and public humiliation had done wonders for Sterling's posture. Tessa laughed then, a real laugh, the kind that bent her forward slightly and made the whole awful evening loosen its grip. In the ride back to the Brainer building, she kept her hand on my knee, not possessive, not dramatic, just there. Every few minutes, her thumb moved, like she was reminding herself I was real. I did not fill the silence. For once, I did not reach for a plan, a reassurance, or an explanation. I let the quiet be a room we could both sit inside without having to escape it. When we got upstairs, she paused outside 4D. The door was locked now. Maintenance had fixed the latch. Security had finally discovered the concept of responding to messages, and Mabel had promised to watch the hallway with what she called retired woman intensity. Tessa looked at her apartment for a long moment, then turned away from it and followed me into 4C. That choice felt different from the night before. The first time she crossed my threshold, she had been measuring danger. This time, she was measuring desire, trust, and whatever fragile thing was beginning between us. In my room, the lamp was still where I had left it, casting the same soft yellow light over the bed, the dresser, the stack of books I had failed to make look casual. Tessa stood in the doorway, smiled faintly, and said my room still looked like a responsible adult had prepared it for a visiting insurance adjuster. I told her I could mess it up if that would help. She said no. She liked that I was steady. She just needed me to understand that steady was not the same as distant. That was when the night finally caught up with her. Not all at once, not in a collapse. She sat on the edge of the bed, took off her earrings, and held them in her palm like tiny evidence of how hard she had tried to be composed. She said she did not know how to do this cleanly. She did not know how to trust a room without checking the exits, how to want someone without bracing for the moment wanting became leverage, how to let a good thing be good without interrogating it until it confessed to being a trap. I sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders touched, and told her I did not know how to do it cleanly either. I knew how to answer calls, lock doors, make coffee, read panic before people named it, and keep my voice calm while everything inside me ran for cover. I did not know how to be wanted without quietly preparing to be left. Tessa turned toward me then, and the tiredness in her face made her more beautiful, not less. She said maybe we did not have to be impressive about it. Maybe we did not have to turn healing into another performance. Maybe the first honest thing was admitting that she wanted to stay in my room tonight, not because she was afraid of hers, but because she wanted to wake up near me and see if wanting still felt true in the morning. I looked at her mouth, then at her eyes, because I was trying to become the kind of man who did not hide from either. I told her I wanted that too. She leaned in and kissed me softly, and there was no storm in it, no panic, no stolen bravery. Just her hand at my jaw, my arm around her waist, and the quiet, terrifying relief of not turning away from something good. We slept above the covers again, because we were both exhausted and because not every intimate thing needs to prove itself by rushing. Sometime in the night, she moved closer, and this time I moved too. I let my arm rest around her instead of pretending it had happened by accident. She fell asleep with her forehead against my shoulder, and I stayed awake longer than I needed to, listening to the building settle, the heater click, the distant elevator groan. My room, which had once been the place where I recovered from everyone else's emergencies, felt different with her in it, less like a bunker, more like a place a life could begin without announcing itself too loudly. In the morning, Tessa woke before me and was sitting cross-legged near my nightstand, assembling something small from folded cardstock she had pulled from her museum bag. Her hair was loose. My sweatshirt from the night before was draped over her lap, and sunlight came through the warehouse windows in pale squares. I asked what she was doing, and she said she was making a room that did not need an exit strategy. When she finished, she set a tiny paper model on my nightstand, 4 little walls, 1 open doorway, and a small square of yellow paper where the lamp would be. It should have looked childish. It didn't. It looked like a promise neither of us was reckless enough to say too loudly yet. She left later that morning to shower, change, and reclaim her own apartment in daylight. But before she went, she turned at my door and asked if I was going to panic now. I told her probably, but in a controlled and deeply masculine way. She smiled and said she would try not to be impressed. Then she kissed me once in the hallway, not hidden, not hurried, and walked into 4D with her shoulders back. I watched her unlock her own door, step inside her own life, and leave mine open behind her without either of us pretending that meant nothing. So when people ask me about the night my new neighbor knocked at midnight and asked if she could stay in my room, I tell them the room was never really the point. The point was that Tessa did not ask me to save her. She asked me to stay close while she remembered how to save herself. And somehow, in the middle of that, she saw the part of me I had hidden behind calm voices, locked drawers, and emergency plans. She saw a man who was tired of being useful and scared to be wanted. Then she wanted him anyway. What would you have done if someone you barely knew knocked on your door at midnight and asked not just for safety, but for closeness? Have you ever met someone at the exact moment you were trying hardest not to need anyone? Tell me in the comments, because I think some people enter our lives like alarms, and others enter like a room finally going quiet. And if this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and come back for the next one.